Well, good evening, everybody. Good to see you here. Appreciate everybody coming out for our Wednesday evening Bible study. And what we did on Sunday is we talked about 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we really went verse by verse on that. And what we'll do tonight is related to 1 Corinthians 7, but it's a little bit broader, and it will sort of set the stage for some of Don's future lessons. And so some of you will remember what at one time was the best-selling newspaper in America. And it's a very distinguished newspaper called the National Enquirer. And they had a little tagline, "Inquiring Minds." Do you remember the rest of it? Yeah, want to know. And so, they would have all this sort of celebrity gossip and things of that nature. And what we'll do here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and in some other chapters is we'll see the church at Corinth, they were inquiring minds. They had some questions that they wanted answered. And so we'll look at those. And this is a pattern that we'll see that Paul will use about 4 different times, is to talk about now concerning this or concerning that. And before we get to those questions, let's just remind ourselves of what was the city of Corinth like? Was this considered sort of the perfect example of morality and justice? And I got some shakes of the head here. Okay, this is kind of a bad place. And if we were going to sort of compare it to something in the U.S. today, what city might we compare Corinth to? Yeah, Las Vegas. And of course, Las Vegas has its own little tagline, "What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas." Okay? And so this is a city that certainly was not the perfect city. And then, of course, people from that city were converted. And they were not perfect either. And so as we go through the book of Corinth, we see some examples of things that were maybe not the way they should have been. So don't skip ahead to where Don hasn't gotten to, but just in the chapters we've covered, what are some of the problems that the church there at Corinth had? Yeah, there's sexual immorality in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. So bad that it was said even the Gentiles in this city, we'll just call it sort of the Vegas of that time, they wouldn't be caught dead doing this. That was pretty serious. What other problems were in the church at Corinth? Yeah, division. Paul says it's reported there are even divisions among you. And so this was an imperfect city made up, or a church there made up of imperfect people. But there was something interesting about them. They were concerned about doing the right thing. And so there's a letter that we don't have, but that letter went to Paul, and it had some questions. And the fact that they were asking questions means that they were interested in doing what was right. If they had no interest, they wouldn't have asked questions. Now, if we had a chance to text Paul or Peter or the Apostle John, that would be very, very neat to be able to do. And some of us, at least I would be tempted to ask some questions like, what's it like to be an apostle? Or what's it like to perform a miracle? There'd be some things that we would be perhaps interested in. But we don't get that sense that these folks at the church in Corinth were asking those types of questions. Instead, we've got things like this. Now, concerning food offered to idols, or if we back up to chapter 7, concerning the matters about which you wrote, and you'll remember verse 1 of chapter 7, we have this, what apparently was a question from the church at Corinth. Is it wrong for 2 people that are married to have sexual relations? So that was a question. And then we've got chapter 8, concerning food offered to idols. They had questions about that. And these are not sort of esoteric questions. These are very practical questions. If you're in a city that is just rampant with prostitution, immorality, then we could see the question in chapter 7, well, hey, we've been converted out of the world. Maybe there's not supposed to be any sexual relations. Or what about food offered to idols? You know, if I'm in the marketplace and I buy food, it had been offered to an idol, am I sinning by doing that? And so these are very practical questions. We'll see here in chapter 12, what about these spiritual gifts? How do we handle these? What's the proper way to do this? And then if we look in chapter 16, now we're getting into money, which is always a very sort of practical subject. What do we do about money? What do we do about collection? What do we do about contribution? And so Paul addresses these questions. So if we think about this place, this background, these are first generation Christians. These would not be somebody that, like some of us could say, well, my mother was a Christian, or my grandmother, or my grandfather. You know, some may go back multiple generations. These were first generation Christians coming out of a very idolatrous and immoral environment. And so that's what they're dealing with. And then think about the first century difficulties that they face. You know, we sometimes say, well, we have all these problems, and we certainly have a lot of problems. I'm not sure our problems in our country really match up well with what these folks were going through. And here's an example, Acts 18. We've got this scene where the proconsul was there. There's an attack on Paul, and they haul him in front of there. And then this ruler of the synagogue is seized. And notice what it says. They beat him in front of the tribunal, but the tribunal paid no attention to this. So imagine whether this might be a judge or might be a governor or a president or a senator, and all of a sudden this mob starts beating somebody in front of the ruling official, and he could care less about this. I mean, this is the type of environment. And we certainly know from our studies about Paul that he was beaten before, he was stoned, he was in prison. And so very difficult times. And again, this city being very immoral. And we know from our study of chapter 7, a lot of these marriages would have been what we might call a mixed marriage, where one person is a Christian and one is not a Christian. And presumably, most of those would have been, they were both non-Christians, and then one person was converted. Well, now what do? I'm now a Christian, and my wife is not a Christian. Or I'm a Christian, my husband's not a Christian. What do we do with this? How do we handle this? Again, these would be challenging circumstances. And you layer on top of that persecution. And so imagine you become a Christian, and now your family, including your non-Christian spouse, are being persecuted. Well, they're probably not thrilled about that situation. So what do we do with that? And then we have and these are slides from Don that I wanted to cover. And I like how he's worded it, 21st century misconception. And we have some ideas sometimes about people being single or people being married or remarried, and we need to make sure that whatever views we have are consistent with the Bible. So 1 Corinthians 7, verse 28, again, we covered this verse by verse last time, but as a reminder, if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, I would spare you that. So sometimes we look at this and we say, Paul was against marriage. He didn't like the idea of marriage at all. Well, let's remind ourselves, who wrote the two texts on the qualifications of elders? Well, that was Paul. Well, what's one qualification of an elder? You got to be married, okay? So I think it would be a little odd for Paul to be anti-marriage, and he's saying, now if you want to have church leaders, which we want, they need to be married. So here's 1 Timothy 5. So I would have younger widows marry bear children, manage your households, give the adversary no occasion for slander. And so this seems a little different than what he says in 1 Corinthians 7 about, now you can marry, but I'd kind of like people to be like me and not be married. So how do we explain the difference? Did Paul just change his mind, or is Paul contradicting himself? Why the two passages here where one indicates a desire that, for example, widows not remarry, and the other seems to be a desire that widows do remarry? So how would you explain that difference? Yeah. I'm sorry, say that again?
Like a circumstantial opinion, saying, hey, if this is option A, if it's this way, option B is just...
Yeah, I think that's right. We have to look at the circumstances of what's going on. Because he talks about in 1 Corinthians 7 this thing of the present distress. Now, he doesn't explain that, but if we just take those words, we say, well, present, that means it's happening right now. Distress, that's not good. That's bad. Bad things are happening right now. So in light of the bad things happening right now, Paul says, my opinion is it'd be great if you did not marry. But he makes it very clear, if you do marry, that is not a problem. That is not sinful. Andy, did you? Okay. So then we have this concept of, and I like how Don put this, singleness. And this is something that we sometimes get a little careless with our language. And we, whether intentionally or not, we give off the impression that if there's a Christian who is single, that is a problem. That is some flaw or something that needs to be fixed. Or as Don said, we sometimes view that as a disease that needs to be cured. And that is not consistent with the Bible. So sometimes we'll hear people say to maybe a single person, well, you can't be happy if you're not married. Now, there would be some married people who would say, you can't be happy if you are married. Okay? So let's be sort of careful about that. And when I was a kid, there was this widow lady, and my father asked her, did you ever think about getting remarried? And she said something, and I thought I understood it, and on the drive home, my dad kind of quizzed me about it and to make sure I understood it. And she said, you don't have to be alone to be lonely. You do not have to be alone to be lonely. And her point was, you can be in a marriage and be terribly lonely. So you can be single and not be lonely at all, and you can be married in a marriage that's not the right marriage and be lonely. So again, this is not something that we should be saying to people who are single or suggesting to them. There are all sorts of reasons why somebody might be single. So it could be circumstances. It could be by choice. To get married, you have to find the right person, and you have to be the right person for them. And there might be somebody who wants to be married, and they just haven't found the right person. Or they're not viewed as the right person. Or it could be just by choice. Maybe there's education, maybe there's career, maybe there's travel, whatever it may be. Somebody may just decide, I want to, for now, or maybe for all time, I want to be single. And then some people would say, I want to be single because that will help me spiritually, because then I'll have this undivided focus towards God. And Paul certainly talks about that. He said, if you're a wife, what is part of your interest? Who are you concerned about? Yeah, your husband. And if you're a husband, part of your interest is, how do I make my wife happy? Well, if you're single, you're not doing that. And so again, it could be by circumstance, could be by choice that somebody is single. And that's not something that we need to say, oh, this has to be fixed. And it doesn't matter what society thinks or what, I may think, oh, this would be great for so-and-so to be married. Well, maybe not. And I need to be careful about sort of expressing that opinion without really knowing the facts. All right. I'm sorry? Okay. So we've got, if you remember, the first 5 verses or so of 1 Corinthians 7 that we covered on Sunday, we have Paul talking in depth about the concept of sexual relations inside of a marriage. And so marriage is God's answer to sexual desire. If you remember going back to chapter 6, there was sort of the argument that Paul anticipated that, the stomach is made for food and food is made for the stomach. And so the argument would be, well, if God made us with sexual desires, then we should be able to satisfy those however we want. And so Paul is addressing that, saying, no, that's not the case here. And let's actually just look at these first 4 or 5 verses. This is in 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 1. Now concerning the matter about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. In my view, this is what they wrote to Paul, saying, hey, this is what we believe. What do you think about this? And he says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time. You may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again. And he tells us why at the end of this verse. So that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so, certainly marriage, one role of marriage is to satisfy sexual desire. And so that's not up for debate. That's what Paul and the Holy Spirit said. And if we think about, well, what about satisfying that desire before we're married or while we're married with somebody else? Well, that would be wrong. So we have here, back up to chapter 6, verse 18, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. So we see the seriousness of these sexual sins here. And so God has given us an outlet for that to say if you're in a proper marriage, then you can satisfy that. All right, so what about the length of time we should be married? Well, we have this in our vows, that this is till death do us part. And that is consistent with what the Bible says. So here's a passage we don't often use, but I think it's a good passage. This is in Malachi. For the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, he covers his garment with violence. It's kind of a strong terminology there. If you divorce, and obviously Matthew 19:9 gives us some reasons that divorce is allowable, but just putting that aside, if you divorce, that is kind of the equivalent of committing violence. So he says, so guard yourselves in your spirit, do not be faithless. And so the idea of marriage, and we see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, remember the dilemma is, well, if I'm a Christian, my wife is not a Christian, and she says, in essence, hey, this is too rough. You being a Christian, I'm facing persecution. I'm going to leave unless you will change. Well, we're supposed to do our best to stay married, but we also don't have to chase down that unbeliever who leaves. And so we have to understand there can be difficult days just within marriage itself, but also, as was brought up, this idea of the present distress. That certainly can bring pressure on a marriage. It still is supposed to be for life, if possible here. So here's 1 Peter. And this isn't specifically about marriage, but this would be about any aspect of our life. When we are going through life as a Christian and we say, wow, I'm facing difficult times. Who knew this could happen? Well, we actually should know that difficult times are going to happen in the past, they're going to happen now, and they're going to happen in the future. So here's what Peter said, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. So again, we're going to have difficult times. We're going to have challenges that come about, whether it's in our job, whether it's in maybe our role as a citizen, and certainly in our family. We're going to have difficult times. We still need to have the mindset of, this is permanent. I signed up for this, and I'm going to do this as long as we're both alive. This is a passage that has caused some confusion. This is in 1 Corinthians 7. This is where, in verse 15, he says, that the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister, in other words, the Christian who has been left by the unbelieving spouse, is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. And so sometimes this is looked at as saying, okay, if your spouse leaves you, then that's fine, and you can remarry now, as long as your spouse leaves you. And what I'd suggest to you is, if we're going to find that written into this text, it needs to match with Matthew 19:9. And in my view, that does not match with Matthew 19:9. Yes, ma'am.
Quick question then. For that verse, is it, I guess, kind of in parallel with verse 14? Because I was taking that as like, if it's the unbelieving spouse that wants to depart, then it's kind of like you have no choice but to let them go. But are you saying it's kind of like opposite, or is it case by case? Like what? I just want to make sure we're saying it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in verse 14, let me actually pull that out and I'll read that. So verse 14 is talking about when the unbelieving spouse wants to leave. So, and actually let's back up to verse 12, and this will get us kind of a running start here. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And let's just stop there. We could kind of see how if I'm not a Christian and I'm married and then I become a Christian and my spouse is saying, I don't want anything to do with Jesus, we might say, well, wait a minute, should I really be connected with them? Maybe my obligation is to divorce that unbelieving spouse. He says, no, don't do that. Verse 13, if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. So really, it's the same thing as verse 12. And then verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now, I don't claim to fully understand every single detail of that verse, but I do get the sense here that he's saying, if you're a Christian and your spouse is not a Christian, there's some sense in which they get some benefit from that. And he's making the point, just like your children would not be considered unholy. And we have certainly passages where Peter talks about a wife may be able to cause her unbelieving husband to become a Christian without even saying a word, just by her conduct. And I think there's some connection here. And then we get to verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. And so the way that I'm looking at this is that if you're married to an unbeliever and they will stay married to you, that's great. You stay in that relationship. But if they leave, and I think the implication is maybe something along these lines, if they come to you and say, I'm going to leave you unless you stop being a Christian. We had a great life before you suddenly got religion here. And now look at our life. It's, pretty rough. So give up your faith and I'll stay married to you. No, you let them depart. You're under no obligation. You're not enslaved to them to follow them and to compromise your morals or to give up worshiping God. Where I think sometimes the confusion comes in is we equate this, saying you're not enslaved, to meaning you're no longer under that marriage bond. And so look at Romans chapter 7. And just to remind us, Romans 7 is not a treatise or a textbook on divorce and remarriage. It's really talking about the law. But he's using an example a comparison here. He'd say, just like marriage, to make a change in the law, there has to be a death. And so he says, for a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. And sometimes I think we make a mistake and we equate these two passages and say, oh, well, if your spouse leaves you, then you're not enslaved. That means you're not under this bondage anymore. So now you can get remarried. And what I'd suggest to you is we always have to go back to Matthew 19:9 to see what did Jesus say, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Yes, sir.
One interpretation that I've heard and have come to understand that it could also mean is when it talks about the wife not having authority, the husband not having authority over his body, the possibility of there being a concern that the unbelieving wife or husband has left, but you're still enslaved to them physically.
Okay.
Is that something?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the question is tying back to those first 5 verses. And it's, I believe, in verse 4 that talks about, the wife doesn't have, control of her body, the husband, etc. And so this could be sort of a connection here to say if you have a spouse who just leaves you, well, now you no longer have any obligation. We have this interesting word, conjugal rights, and that you wouldn't have any further obligation because they've left, and that may very well be part of it as well. So thank you for that comment. So let's look at here in Luke, and then we'll get to Matthew in just a second. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, that's a very odd statement, isn't it? Apparently, Jesus wants you to hate your spouse and your kids and your parents and even hate yourself. So this is a very interesting religion that we have here. Or does this mean something else? So what does he mean when he says you have to hate your father, your mother, your spouse, your children? Yes, sir.
Our earthly relationships come second to following God.
That's right. So our number one priority is to God. Now, our other relationships, we have responsibility. But by comparison, it's almost like, well, you hate your earthly relationships because God has to come first. So when we think about this context of what if you have a spouse, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it's an unbelieving spouse who says, I'm going to leave unless you give up your relationship with God. Now you could see somebody going, well, I'm really supposed to be, my spouse is number one. Well, no. Number 2, not number 1. Number 1 by far is God. And so that's always something for us to keep in mind that if there's any conflict here, we, just like the apostles said that one time, we must obey God rather than man. And so if we have a spouse who says, you cannot partake of the Lord's Supper, or you can't ever pray again. Well, if the Lord tells me to take the Lord's Supper or to pray, then it doesn't matter what my spouse says because I've got to obey God rather than men. Okay, so here's this verse, and this is not a class on, we're going to go through every possibility of divorce and remarriage, but it's a very direct passage. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, and let's leave out the exception, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Pretty clear. You're married, you divorce your wife, and then you get remarried. What have you committed? Adultery. Okay? So he could have just said it that way. But he does put in this exception. Except for sexual immorality, which the implication would be if you divorce your spouse for sexual immorality and then you marry, what have you not committed? Yeah, you've not committed adultery. Now, if we want to think of this as a second exception, the second exception would be if our spouse dies. And we see that in 1 Corinthians. We just saw that in Romans. There's a connection or a bond between husband and wife. And when one of those, the husband or the wife dies, there is no more bond. And so that's why in 1 Corinthians 7 and about verse 39, it would say that if a woman's husband dies, then she can remarry. And we talked about that expression, in the Lord, what that means. And so here we have the rule laid out by Jesus. If you divorce and then remarry, you've committed adultery unless you divorce for sexual immorality. Okay. So when we look at this part, and I like how Don worded this, concern for the Lord is foremost. And this ties in with what was just mentioned about God has to come first. And everything has to sort of yield to that fact that God comes first. And so here in chapter 7, verse 35, I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Now, in the context of this chapter, he does talk about if you're married, then you may not be totally undivided. And he does not say that that's sin, but this is the goal. As much attention, as much focus as you can put on the Lord. And that should be our goal. So if we are thinking about a career or a specific job, and that job will interfere with our service to the Lord, what should we do? Yeah, we give that up. Well, what if it pays more money than another job that would allow me to serve the Lord? Give that up. Well, what if I have some friends that I really enjoy these friends, but they influence me to turn away from God? What should I do? Find new friends, right? Whatever fill in the blank it is, if this is impacting my ability to serve the Lord, then I need to get rid of that. Could be a job, could be friends, could be a hobby, recreation, could be education, whatever it is. If it gets between me and the Lord, then I need to get that out of the way. Okay? So, verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. And we won't rehash everything we talked about on Sunday. One view of this, which I don't think is correct, is that if you're a Christian and your spouse dies, you can only marry another Christian. I think that's incredibly wise to do. Stated differently, I think it's incredibly foolish to marry a non-Christian. I don't think that's what this verse is talking about. I think this is saying, make sure that you are following God's commands when you marry. In other words, you have a right to marry, you're entering into the marriage properly. Again, everything should yield to God. And when we think about marrying somebody who's not going to help us get to heaven, we have to ask ourselves, why would we do that? Now, for a lot of these Corinthians, they were already married. And then one of them was converted. And so, Paul again answers that question. Well, should you just leave your unbelieving spouse? Well, no, don't do that. But if we have a choice in the matter, it's best not to enter into a relationship, should be the most important relationship we have, with somebody who's not going to help us get to heaven. And maybe they'll be neutral, or maybe they'll be sort of dragging us down. But we should try to find somebody that will help us get to heaven if we're going to marry. All right, so here, if you know Don Truex, he likes 3, right? So we've got 3 take-homes. Everything I do affects me spiritually. So what would not be included in the word everything? It really is. It's everything. My job, my recreation, my hobbies, my friendships, maybe where I live, just whatever it is that I do, this is going to affect me spiritually. If I'm in a job that I'm, let's take a crazy example. I'm selling illegal drugs. I'm selling cocaine. Well, I can't say, well, that's just my work. It doesn't affect me as a Christian. Well, probably does affect us as a Christian. My friends, how do they influence me? Doesn't the Bible say something about do not be deceived? Something about evil companions, corrupt. And so everything is going to affect me spiritually. Every area of my life is open to God. Particularly in our country, we value privacy. I think that's a good thing in general. But we can get carried away with that and say, if somebody comes up to me and says, hey, John, I see something you're doing, and I don't think that's maybe the best thing or the right thing. And I go, that's none of your business. This is my life. Well, it's actually not my life. My life belongs to the Lord. And so every area of my life is really open to the Lord. Who I choose to marry, what job I have, my friends, my recreation, all the things I consume. God has a say in that. And I can't say to God, that's none of your business. Because He created me, and I belong to Him. It's a passage from Hebrews. No creature is hidden from His sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of Him to whom we must give account. So take that last expression, to whom we must give account. What is that talking about? So give an account to God. When do we give an account to God?
When we die.
Yeah, when we die. Day of judgment. And so at some point, God is going to examine us and say, let's see what you were doing in all aspects of your life. And we're not going to be able at that point to say, that was none of your business, God. You just ignore that part. You can't do that. You can't do that on this earth. And so understanding what we do is all open to God. And then the final thing, what I think may well be wrong. And that may seem like an odd statement, but think about this church at Corinth. They sent these questions to Paul. And they had certain ideas. Remember chapter 7, verse 1, it's improper for a man and his wife to have sexual relations. Like, well, no, they were wrong about that. Okay? And we're going to see as we go into chapter 8 and then with spiritual gifts and even the contribution that people can have the wrong idea. And if we have the wrong idea, that can lead us to the wrong conclusion. And so let's take an example. In John chapter 11, Jesus was dealing with, actually we'll back up to, I guess it's John chapter 9, the man who was born blind. And you remember the apostles had a thought about if a man was born blind, then they said, who sinned? This man, or what was the other option? Yeah, his parents. I mean, obviously it's one of the two, right? Either this guy sinned, I'm not sure how he sinned before he was born, unless this was sort of an example of this idea of you inherit sin, which is not correct, or his parents sinned. And Jesus said, no, you're missing the point here. And we can have, another example is when Jesus was talking to Peter after the resurrection and telling him what's going to happen, and Peter said, well, what about this guy here? And talking about the Apostle John, and Jesus said, well, what does it matter to you? If he's going to stay alive till I come back, what does that matter? And if you remember, it says the saying went out that the Apostle John would never die. But that's not what was said. And so we have to be careful. We can have very strongly held beliefs. That's good. But we always have to be willing to re-examine those beliefs, because these folks in Corinth, they had some ideas that were wrong. And a credit to them that they asked questions. And then when we get to 2 Corinthians, we see that they certainly made some changes. And so we need to do the same. So this is be our final verse here. And this is a very familiar verse from Isaiah. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, my ways are higher than your ways, my thoughts and your thoughts. So we may think something, but we always need to examine that with the Scripture. And I'll leave you with one last example. Remember Naaman, leprosy, told to go dip in the which river? Jordan River? He said, wait a minute, why would I go in the Jordan River? That's a nasty river. I got much better rivers. And he said, "Behold, I thought." The prophet would come out, wave his hand, make the leprosy go away. We have to be careful when we say, "Behold, I thought." It's fine to have thoughts and conclusions. Always match it with the Scripture. And if we do that our entire life, then we'll continuously get better and better. And that's part of why we do these Bible studies. So thank you very much for your participation and attention. And Sunday, we're not having Bible class, if I remember right. And we'll have 2 sermons. And so be back next Wednesday, and Don will be here for chapter 8. Or not even next Wednesday. Yeah, so song service next Wednesday. And so Don will see y'all in like 4 weeks, I think. So.